Hello there, this is our weekly look at events inside Syria. I'm James Bays. 10 months of protests and a violent crackdown have taken a severe toll on the Syrian economy, with the currency weakening, recession deepening and the government so short of cash it's been forced to levy a special tax on state workers. Analysts say the dramatic decision by Arab states to turn against President Bashar al-Assad has further damaged Syria's economy. Some even believe it poses a graver challenge to Assad's survival than the country's uprising. A recent report suggests public expenditure in 2011 has already increased by $19 billion, mainly because of increased military costs, while public revenue has gone down by $2.31 billion. Cargo volumes passing through Syrian ports declined by 35 to 40% in the first 8 months of last year, losing the economy an estimated $6.1 billion. The Syrian Ministry of Economy says the price of food in Syria has surged at the end of 2011, some items increasing by up to 37% compared with the same period in 2010. With the Syrian central bank's currency reserves depleted, it'll become trickier for the government to support the Syrian pound at the official rate, £47 to the dollar. On the black market, the value of the pound against the dollar has fallen to £62 to the dollar, which means that in reality, Syrians have lost some 25% of their spending power. Joining us now are our guests, our panel of experts. In Dubai, prominent Syrian economist Samir Seifan. He used to be an advisor to the Syrian government but now lives in exile. In London, Ammar Waqqaf. He's a member of the Syrian Social Club. That's a group of UK-based Syrians supporting reform, but reform led by the government. And in Washington, D.C., Mona Yacoubian. She's a senior advisor at the think tank, the Stimson Center, and she directs the center's new project, Pathways to Progress, Peace, Prosperity and Change in the Middle East. Can I start with you, Mr. Seifan? I know you're outside Syria now, but you speak to people I know regularly there. Tell us your view. How bad is the situation with regard to the economy right now?
Actually, first of all, the Syrian economy was not basing on a strong basis due many things, including the lack of capability of managing the country politically and economically. And after the uprising in Syria, the situation, economic situation was coming down due many factors. First of all, for example, the tourism is just coming to be less than 20–30% out of it was making around 11%. Now we don't have tourism outside of the country, which was very important. The industry shrinking, the expenditure by the citizen by themselves shrinking, the market shrinking. This cause release of part of the labor from industry. The same in tourism, the transportation, etc. And on top of that, we have every year in Syria around 200,000 newcomers to the labor market to be added to high level of jobless, which was around 15%, and now I think it is around 30%. So the situation is coming down in general as economy, and also the government itself using the resources from one side to finance the army, to finance to combating the demonstrator from one side, and the revenue of the government itself shrinking, coming down due people not paying taxes and the production of oil and gas coming down. So many reasons making this economic situation more and more difficult.
Okay, Mr. Waqqaf, do you agree with that? We have severe economic decline. Would you agree?
I wouldn't say it's severe. I would definitely agree with Dr. Seifan about the fact that there is economic decline. However, Syrians are finding alternatives at the moment. I think the main problem in Syria was at the very beginning or very start of the events was the lack of security, which meant that the domestic economy was very much crippled. I'm adding obviously to the issue of tourism, to the issue of oil embargo that Dr. Seifan touched upon. But people could not get their goods from point A to point B. Nowadays, this has been overcome a little bit, so there's a light at the end of the tunnel there, especially with the government successfully tackling places like Restan, Tel Bisi, where they had direct input on the Aleppo-Damascus highway. Now, with regards to external trade, I think Syrians now are heading east towards Iraq, where they have a large purchasing power, and they're finding alternative markets. It is going down, the economy, and it is a bleak forecast, I would have to agree, yes, but it's not that bleak, it's not that severe, and hopefully Syrians will find alternatives.
Mona Yacoubian, would you agree with that? Syrians are finding ways round the sanctions, ways round the economic problems?
You know, I don't think that's actually borne out by reports we're hearing. I mean, we're hearing reports of people needing to queue up now for all kinds of heating gas, and also having issues with potential food shortages. There's issues with the depreciation of the Syrian pound. Inflation is on the rise. Unemployment is an issue. I think that Dr. Seifan probably has more appropriately described the situation economically. I think the sanctions are absolutely having a bite inside the country.
OK, well, let's see what the government themselves are saying. The Syrian Economy Minister, Mohammed Nidal al-Shah, said at a conference that the economy is in a state of emergency. In October, he said unemployment is rising, imports are falling, and the government income is reduced in areas where there are protests. There's no economic activity, so people aren't paying tax. Having said that, earlier this year, just a few weeks ago, on the 3rd of January, the same minister, Mr. al-Shah, contradicted his earlier view, and he said, and I quote, "The Syrian economy is still strong, and the only solution to control the price of goods is to support and develop local industries and increase productivity." Mr. Seifan, if I can ask you about that, which one of those two views, and we hear two views there from the economy minister, is the right one?
Actually, we don't expect from Syria minister to speak frankly. He needs to make a bit make up. This is the policy in Syria. But we take as economists, and I left Syria 4 months ago, and I am in daily contacts with Syria. If we take the exchange rate of Syrian pound vis-a-vis the US dollar, before the uprising it was 46.5 Syrian pound for $1, and now more than 62. It is 33% decline. It is a big indicator from one side. The price of the goods, the service rising in Syria, and also as Mona said, there is a shortage in many products on the market, especially the oil product. Oil production is very important for Syria, and Syria is facing difficulties to export around 140,000 barrels per day, used to export to outside, mainly to Europe, more than 1,100 barrels per day, and it was making around $5 billion per year, and now it's very difficult to export due there is nobody purchasing, and there is difficulty by transportation, difficulty by insurance, difficulty by make money transaction. For that, the production of oil and gas declining. Oil and gas now making around, it was making around 25 to 30%, and which was making big part of revenue of hard currency. Without hard currency, how can you deal? If you take the sanctions against not just the trade, oil and gas, also against the central bank, the bank system in Syria, this system is not able to make any money transaction, and without making money transaction, you can imagine which difficulties facing by the private sector and by the state itself. The state now not able to import directly any equipment for power station, for example. So you
Mona Yacoubian, can I ask you about that? Because we've heard there about the situation, they can't export their oil, but actually the Syrian people are suffering because they can't get the fuel that they want. There is a sort of irony here, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting.
Go ahead, Mona.
It's interesting because, yes, I was going to say it's interesting because there was an attempt to there are no sanctions on refined oil products, precisely to try and spare the Syrian population those kinds of hardships. But as Samir noted earlier on, first, the government itself is using a lot of gasoline and so forth in its operations, its repressive operations in various cities and towns across the country. In addition, there is also now such an atmosphere of uncertainty around any kind of economic activity, transactions with Syria, that it is having a dampening effect. And so as a result, there are, I think, fewer imports of refined gas and so forth, leading again to these shortages of heating oil. There are power cuts in cities in Damascus and Aleppo. This was unheard of prior to the uprising.
Can I ask you, Mr. Waqqaf,
Well,
we've heard about the problem with fuel, we've heard about the unemployment, we've heard about the tourism. Tell me, which of these factors do you think should worry the regime in Damascus the most?
I think I'll have to correct some notions before
Go
I
ahead.
get into that. But I mean, for example, the power cuts are not because of fuel shortages at all. It's because some gas lines that fuel electricity stations are being attacked by the armed groups, and people are suffering because of that. The government, you know, is not exporting oil, that's for sure, but it's not importing fuel oil. You know, the oil gets refined into basic stuff, and some of that stuff is being used, I'm trying to be simplistic here, is used in heating. The government used to import quite a large amount of that in addition to what it usually refines. So apparently the markets are not selling Syria at the moment, a lot of that. So that may explain a little bit also the shortage. I've been in Syria in the past 2 weeks. I only came back to London on Sunday. And I can tell you that when I had visited Syria back in July and had a trip across the country, everybody called me mad. Why are you going? And indeed, like at least 1/4 or 1/3 of the whole journey, I was alone in the car and there were no cars around. Nowadays, I made a similar trip. I also visited Homs, for example, and there were, you know, the highway was lively with cars, as you would expect at this time of the year.
But
So
which are
the
the
situation
factors
is getting better, actually.
Which of the factors that we've discussed worries you most? Which area of the economy that's suffering worries you most?
Going back to the question, I actually agree with your two honourable guests on the bleak picture about tourism and so on. But I also worry about the government deficit or the future government deficit, because in order to counter the economic effects or the lack of productivity, the government will have to invest in order to increase the production capacity. It will have to invest to finance its own measures that it has taken. We know that there was a U-turn with regards to reducing the subsidy on fuel oil, for example. But now the government has made a U-turn in order to ease the tension among the population, and that has to be financed. And as long as the government is not exporting the oil it had been exporting prior to the crisis, they will have to borrow money, for example, from the central bank in order to finance that. Well, the government is also going to increase perhaps production or to invest in order to kick the economic cycle again in real estate, for example, manufacturing, whatever it is. It seems that we're heading back towards a more socialist economy, in opposite to the liberalization that we've heard about and we've experienced in the past decade since President Assad came. The government has to do that, and funding that sort of U-turn is going to be very costly. So that's worrying me even more.
Samir Seifan, you used to advise the Syrian government. Sanctions are nothing new for them, are they? The Americans have had sanctions against Syria since 2004.
Let me first of all correct something. Actually, the lack of electricity production reduced by around 2,000 megawatt out of 8,000, so around 25%. And the reason is lack of fuel, because to exploit any gas pipeline, and I was working for gas for gas and oil sector for many years, could be repaired in 10 days. So this is not the reason. First of all, availability of products and mazot and others.
The attacks are quite frequent these days, actually, Dr. Seifan.
Okay. Samir Seifan, continue, please.
Okay, let me complete naturally. the sanction you are asking about, actually, Syria facing the sanction, such a very tough sanction for first time, Accountability Act, the end of 2004, imposed by USA, it was very light. First of all, Syria has no economic relation, strong economic relation with USA, so it has no impact, actually. For first time, Syria facing such kind of sanction against the trade, against investment, against oil and gas, against the banking sector, the central bank and others.
Okay.
So it is very tough, and it is very, very difficult to afford such kind of sanction. For that, the impact, first of all, is very tough. You can join this impact in the situation in general caused by this situation, by the uprising. Now, there is no investment, no money transferred from Syrian expat to the country. There is lack of revenue for the state, and the state at the same time increased the budget by 60% or 58%, where usually was increasing around 10-12%, not more, which is not going to be realized.
Let me stop you there. As Syria's economy staggers, some neighbouring countries could be key, providing a lifeline despite the sanctions. Those countries are Lebanon, which has strong political ties with its larger neighbour. Hezbollah is a key Syrian ally, and Syria and Lebanon's economies are closely linked too. Syria is Lebanon's only overland trade route, and several Lebanese banks operate there. Lebanon abstains from November's Arab League vote to impose economic sanctions. Then there's Iraq, Syria's second biggest trading partner. It also abstained in the Arab League vote. Official figures show the trade between the two countries reached nearly $3 billion last year, and there's almost 250,000 Iraqis living and working in Syria. And finally, of course, there's Iran, which is Syria's closest ally in the region and potentially its strongest economic lifeline. It has billions of dollars of investments in Syria, ranging from energy and construction to automobiles and cement. Analysts say that Iran could help Syria by buying their crude oil, which is now under Western sanctions, or by allowing it to pay for imports in Syrian currency. Mona Yacoubian, there are ways that Syria can use its neighbours and allies to get around sanctions, aren't there?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think you rightly point out that Syria's immediate neighbors, with the exception of Turkey, which I think we need to talk about at some point, but certainly Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, which you also didn't mention, those countries certainly may well be open to continuing to allow trade and avoid any Arab League sanctions if they are in fact put in place. Iran, I think, is important, but let's also note that Iran itself is coming under its own pressure with the threat of additional international sanctions and so forth. So I think it's going to be very important to keep an eye on what happens inside Iran. But I think one of the key players in all of this is Turkey. And Turkey has certainly indicated that it may well impose some kind of trade embargo. It's looking at alternative routes outside of Syria via Iraq, for example, and I think this could have a significant impact on the Syrian economy.
Mr. Waqqaf, can I ask you about the capital, Damascus, and also Aleppo, the second city? They haven't joined the protests in quite the same way as other parts of the country, and some say that's because of the merchant class there who are still backing the regime. Do you think in the long term those people, as economic fortunes change, may change their view and join the opposition?
We need to understand very much why Damascus and Aleppo and Al-Raqqa, for example, never really participated in this. It was said from the very beginning that it was because of economic reasons, because of the merchant class ties with the regime and so on and so forth. But I think people have more reasons than that. Definitely the economic sanctions that are imposed by the Arab League and imposed by the Western Hemisphere play that game and say, well, if the sanctions are effective, then it will, break the bond between the merchant class or the middle class and the regime. But I think people in Damascus and Aleppo have decided not to join with this movement for completely different reasons. I think there is the issue of identity, not the the issue is that people from outside Syria think that all Syrians are up in arms against the regime, but that's not the fact. The fact is that there is only a small, well, I wouldn't call them even small, but at least there is a part of the Syrian population who are up in arms against the Syrian government. But there are other people who have decided not to join in for various reasons, one of which is the issue of identity. Because what happened during the first few weeks is that this movement, if you want to call it rebellion as well, has fallen down the lines of a religious sort of movement. And immediately, and this is not talked about very much in the media, the question of the identity of Syria was immediately, put to the question. And Syrians have decided to keep their Syrian identity. They want a Syria with a national identity rather than with a religious identity. And I think that explains a lot why Damascus, Aleppo, Al-Raqqa and a larger part of the Syrian population never really wanted to participate in this and prefer to go on with the Syrian government, the current incumbent government, and its leadership towards reform. Now, I don't think the economic sanctions at all are going to bring down the fall of the regime. We've had similar case in the late 70s and 80s, and the Syrian pound depreciated against the dollar tenfold, and this did not bring down the Syrian government, and I cannot see really. I would be very surprised to see the Syrian government go because of such sanctions.
OK, well, in a lengthy speech we had this week, President Bashar al-Assad stressed the strength of the Syrian economy, asking people to turn back from consumerism to productivity.
Recently, after opening our economy, we turned it into a consumer. Therefore, we must put an emphasis on the level of productivity, and we are capable even in this crisis, to increase our productivity. We are aware that we have great points of strength. We have a very low debt. We have good relations with great industrial countries. We are in the 5th or in the 4th place in terms of production of olive.
The Syrian president there, his critics may say clutching not at straws but at olives. Mona Yacoubian, we haven't yet seen the Syrian president and the regime try to use sanctions as a rallying call, as perhaps we did in the past, Saddam Hussein or even Fidel Castro in Cuba in the dispute with the Americans. Do you think that's going to happen?
I do. I mean, I think that it is already beginning to happen a bit, and I think that this is kind of the double-edged issue with regard to economic sanctions. I mean, first of all, it is important to try and ensure that the sanctions don't affect adversely ordinary Syrians. That's very hard. I think it's going to become increasingly more difficult as winter wears on. I think we can very much expect the Syrian regime to play this card of being besieged by the West and putting the blame on the international community. Whether or not it works, though, I think is a whole other question. I mean, I think it's really not clear at all how the Syrian public is going to respond to the increasing economic pressure, diplomatic isolation. I think that the strategy underlying those measures is that those that are on the fence will, in fact, turn against the regime. And I think the alternative at this point is if we don't see some kind of a move either to pressure Assad to step down or perhaps some kind of a military coup, Syria will likely descend into civil war.
Mr. Waqqaf, can I ask you a quick view on that? Do you think that the sanctions are going to work against the regime or for the regime? Quick answer.
I think the sanctions are hurting the country as a whole, but in a sense they would work in the long term, perhaps, I think, towards the benefit of the country as a whole.
Thank you so much to our panel of guests in Dubai, Samir Seifan, in London, Ammar Waqqaf, and in Washington, D.C., Mona Yacoubian. And thanks very much to you for watching. To watch our show online, please go to our website, aljazeera.com. We've reached the end of this show. Please join us next week when we take another look inside Syria. Until then, have a good week. Bye-bye.